Good evening to everyone joining us live for this In Conversation With event, and hello also to everyone watching this later on YouTube. It's good to see you all. This is our series of events where we have just chats really with extremely interesting humanists or people with humanist type beliefs about their books or their work or their projects or their lives. And we're really pleased this evening to be with Christina Patterson, who by invoking her, I can make her a peer. Christina Patterson, well known, of course, to a great number of you, I'm sure, writer, broadcaster, critic, currently with the Sunday Times, formerly columnist at The Independent, regular guest on all sorts of broadcast outlets. I often see her late at night on Sky News, I think, when a couple of glasses down. Me, I mean, not her.
Me too.
Yeah, we all are. And her last book, The Art of Not Falling Apart, was the topic of our last in-person convention, where she spoke back in Leicester in 2019. It seems a lifetime ago, but also just only yesterday. And her new book, Outside the Sky is Blue, has been beautifully reviewed, wonderfully reviewed, praised to the rafters. Having finished it off myself this week, I can say that all that praise is justified. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about other things. She's also been a guest on our podcast, What I Believe, so download that if you haven't already, because she is, of course, amongst all her many other accomplishments and fascinators, a patron of Humanist UK. Hello, Christina, how are you?
Hello, Andrew. Well, I'm completely overwhelmed by that. Such a flattering introduction that I'm just going to sit here and smile like a Cheshire cat for the rest of it. Extremely interesting people, you said. So that's very nice. Thank you.
You'll be in that funny phase right now, I guess, when a book's just come out, when you're sort of you're nourished by the praise, but you're also slightly wild with worry that, you know, are people going to say nice things? Are people going to?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, we were just talking about this just before this started, but huge relief when the reviews come out and when they are positive. I remember last time around there was one review in a paper close to my heart that the tone was really unpleasant, and I read it and I felt sicker and sicker and sicker, and that is just such a horrible feeling. It's part of the deal if you write books and you put them out in a public arena, but it's just such an enormous relief to have had positive review coverage. And thank you for your lovely introduction. I'm really delighted to be here. I'm a big fan of Humanist UK. I've been a patron, and in its previous incarnation I was called something else. I can't remember what, but anyway,
distinguished supporters we used to have.
That's it, yes. Oh, distinguished. I think I prefer that, actually. Can we go back to that?
Well, a lot of people didn't. It was strange. People actually turned down invitations to be distinguished supporters. You'd make invitations to people and they say, I'm not sure I'm that distinguished.
No, well,
and you have to quibble with them about this, but that's why we changed it. Well, never mind about that one bad review. We know from your books that you're resilient enough to deal with it, because that is the theme, not just of your Art of Not Falling Apart, but also very much your latest book as well, which, amongst other things, and we'll come to it, come to discussing it some more, is of course a story of resilience and the sources of resilience and the nature of resilience and your own resilience. But I'm just always fascinated by this one period in your life that I think we'll start with, because I think our audience is fascinated by it too. The period in your life when you really loved Jesus.
Yeah.
Love Jesus so much. And it's so funny in this book, actually, encountering, as it were, through your own contemporary words, not just your memories, of just how much you love Jesus and just how much you deplored all the people who didn't love Jesus and the people who blasphemed him and so on and so forth. How did that episode of your life begin and end?
Oh, goodness. Well, that is a sort of 1,000-word page book in its own right. But yes, I sort of loved Jesus. I sort of hated him as well, which is part of the story. But I was brought up in a church-going family, but very gentle Anglicanism. Neither of my parents ever talked about God. You would never, if you said, oh my God, that would be really frowned on. But my father had a Bible. No, I think he had a prayer book on his bedside table, and every Sunday we had to go to church. You never talked about it afterwards, but it was just what you had to do to get your Sunday roast chicken and your apple crumble for some years, and then Mum switched to vanilla ice cream and chocolate sauce for some reason. She only ever had 2 puddings, and those were them. And so obviously I was bored out of my skull at church. It was extremely boring. It was a kind of very gentle, the kind of church where, you know, the children would troop up with a daffodil on Mother's Day, and you'd go off to Sunday school, and you weren't engaged with it in any way at all, and you're bored stiff and sort of playing with the, you know, dust balls in the pew. But it was very benign, and had I listened to any of it, I'm sure I would have found it, you know, perfectly pleasant and telling people they needed to be good and kind and so on. But by the time I was probably 12 or 13, I had discovered the existentialists through French literature at school, or rather French at school. So I was reading Camus and Sartre, and obviously decided that I was going to be an existentialist, smoking Gauloise and sipping tiny cups of coffee in Les Deux Magots in Paris, and was not going to be saddled with this boring church-going nonsense anymore, and made such a fuss about it that in the end my parents just got sick of it and said, okay, fine, you don't have to go to church anymore. So I stopped going to church, all fine. Trajectory of my life could have been very different. However, my school, which was a girls' grammar school, 3 years after I went to it, turned comprehensive, and my brother's school, which was the boys' grammar school, became an independent school, thus depriving my school of its source of boys, because traditionally our school had paired off with that school for discos and square dances and things like that. Obviously, age 14, your burning mission in life is to find a boy. And I was reading Jackie magazine, my sister had it, and with, things like, dear Kathy and Claire, I don't know how to kiss. And then Kathy and Claire would give kind of, advice about how to kiss a boy, but you had to find a boy before you could kiss a boy. So in the end, a friend in my brother's class invited him along to a youth club. Now, I can't remember whether I actually knew that the youth club was attached to a Baptist church. If I knew that, I swiftly pushed that thought out of my head, because what I do remember is feeling a genuine sense of surprise when I discovered it was attached to a church, because it was a church called Millmead, which was a 1970s block. It didn't look church-like. The members of the youth club, the boys had, leather jackets and jeans and motorbikes. They were very, very, very cool for a 14-year-old swat in Guildford. And I remember being very surprised when various people said, oh, do you want to come to church? And obviously I wanted to see the boys with leather jackets and the motorbikes anywhere they went. Had it been a strip club, I'd have gone there. But unfortunately, it was a Baptist church. So I went along to the Baptist church, and there was a very, very charismatic preacher called David Pawson, who he absolutely had, the gift. And he was so mesmerizing that he would end his sermons with a kind of, call to, I think it's called call to, I can't remember what they call it, an altar call, they call it, where basically they would say, therefore you need to give your life to the Lord Jesus Christ. And at the end of one service, shortly after I started going, I turned to my best friend Louise, who I'd also dragged along to the youth club. Unfortunately, luckily, she got out of it and I didn't. And I said, oh, I've done it. I've given my life to Jesus. And she said, oh, I have too. So that was the start of my new life. And it's interesting hearing you say, oh, you love Jesus, because did I love Jesus? I mean, I certainly liked the boys in leather jackets, and I liked the kind of very highly charged atmosphere where you were told that there was this being, this personalized God, who cared about every single aspect of your life and wanted you to serve him, and had a path for your life. And it was all unbelievably narcissistic, actually, really, in lots of ways, because it was all about you. On the other hand, the flip side was that unfortunately all the things you liked doing, or many of them, you could apparently no longer do, because, for example, the boys were now strictly verboten, because
exactly, and that was the whole purpose of
that
going
was the
there.
whole purpose. So it was probably the most counterproductive thing I've ever done. And to cut a long story short, I got caught up in the whole thing, really caught up in it, and I didn't escape until I was 26. And if you want to know the full story of why I got out of it, you would probably need to read the book. But thank you, Andrew. But it is largely, I got ill, and everybody kept telling me that the Lord wanted to heal me, but the Lord seemed to show no sign whatsoever of wanting to heal me. And so in the end, I literally told, and I'm sorry, the bad language follows, I told God to fuck off. And that was that.
And he did.
And he did.
And
Well,
he did.
I don't know if he did, but I did. So.
And I think that shows, doesn't it, that it was never going to stick with you, because especially in all the things that have happened since, you would have relapsed if you were if that was going to be your source of comfort.
Yes.
So I think
well, the thing is, it was the exact opposite of comfort. So much had gone wrong in my life by that point, and I just felt that I was kind of screaming at a void, which indeed I was, I believe. But it was to believe that there is an omnipotent God who wants to answer prayers and then doesn't. You can only conclude that this creature is deeply malign and cruel and vicious, and that's what I did conclude.
Among the many things that your book is about, it's very much about family. And I was just struck by when you were saying earlier about your mum, when you were talking about her 2 puddings, apple crumble and vanilla ice cream and chocolate sauce. And I've heard you speaking these terms before, and it's very much in the book. You often fall back on a vignette like that, which is very powerful, because it sort of, betrays such fondness and affection and nostalgia and feeling. And this book is a very warm book from that point of view, in spite of all the other, I mean, it's a roller coaster, obviously, like, in all sorts of ways. But, do you find that having lost every member of your family, maybe we ought to fill in the gaps on that story for people who are listening who haven't read, that's when you really realize the importance of family, because this book is really almost like an homage to family as much as it is anything else. So maybe tell us a little bit about the loss of family and what family means to you now in consequence.
Well, we all have one at some point, don't we? I mean, most people have one at some point. I don't have a family of my own, and that's also, in a way, one of the themes of the book. It's having lost both my siblings and both my parents, and none of us being married and having children. That meant that I am the last in the line. And so when actually what happened was that I remember speaking at your annual conference in Leicester in June 2019, and I think it was 2 weeks later that my brother died very, very suddenly. And I obviously, it was horrific. And one of the things, as his only sort of relative, I had to clear out his house, and the house had a lot of stuff from my parents as well, photo albums, so on. In fact, these behind me, I've been doing Sky News from here for 2 years, and initially people would always say, "Oh, what are those things behind you?" And every time I'd have to say my late mother's photo albums. They just happened to fit on this shelf. So of course I love my family. Most people love their families, and of course it feels like a terrible and discombobulating thing. You feel unmoored, unanchored when you don't have a family anymore, and particularly when you haven't done the thing that most people do, which is find a partner and have children and produce a family of your own. But I do think, I think the book is it is a homage to, or homage, I never know how to pronounce that actually. Is it homage or homage? Anyway,
it doesn't matter.
Anyway,
Homage.
whatever. Homage.
Let's go full English. An homage.
Okay, a homage to I don't know if it's a homage to family. It's definitely homage to my family.
It felt like a homage to family to me.
Yes, it probably is actually. I think it's probably partly about the kind of how family, the bonds of love, but also the other bonds, the much less comfortable ones, bonds of envy, sibling rivalry, at times hate, because hate is the other side of love. And I found a shocking diary entry of my sister's at one point, which deeply shocked and upset me. My sister had schizophrenia. She was diagnosed, I think, in probably her early 20s, but she had her first breakdown when she was 14 and when I was 9. And that's one of the themes of the book, of the kind of the toll that a mental illness takes, not just on the person who has it, which is generally enormous, but also on the family. And her illness had a huge impact on our family, and I think on my brother and I. And so it is about the kind of complicated love and loyalty and bonds and behavior of a family. And as you say, actually, I think you're right, of families more broadly, because everybody's, well, as Tolstoy said, every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, which is not to say I want to categorize my family as unhappy. That there were a lot of troubles in it, but huge amounts of love and joy as well.
So what did you feel that the book was about as you were reflecting on it afterwards, or as you set out to write it?
Well, it was certainly a family memoir, which is the subtitle, and it is essentially the story of my family from my parents meeting. My parents had a very romantic meeting. They met on a hill in Heidelberg when my mother was 18 and my father was 21, and apparently it was love at first sight. And my mother was Swedish, my father was Scottish. They didn't speak each other's language, so they spoke in German, or they wrote their love letters to each other in German. So frankly, try following that. You just can't, basically. And it completely set the bar way too high for me on a romantic front for a very, very long time. But I suppose I think you only know after you've written a book what it's about. And it is about love, obviously. And as I said, about mental illness. I think it's also, as you said, Andrew, not that I intended it to be. I think it's about resilience. I don't even like the word resilience, actually, but I suspect that everything I write will in some way be about resilience, simply because my family story and then lots of things in my own life meant that I've had to develop a fair bit of it. And it's about religion. It's about how we find meaning in life. It's about how we define success. I think I grew up with a model of what a successful life should be, and that model included, or was very heavily based on, getting married, having a family, being a good citizen, doing your duty to society, and ideally having a successful career was not really part of what I was brought up to expect, but to be a decent member of society who contributed to society. That was a really central part of my upbringing. So actually, now that I think about it, I think that a very central theme is about goodness. I think it's partly about how to be a good person.
And you've got lots of models, negative and positive, of that throughout the book, with the people that you know, both in your family and in your love life, which is another theme, isn't it? Of the thing. You mentioned the bar having been set high by your, this is the same in my family, actually, as it happens. My grandparents met in the park, my mum's parents went there, and my grandma was on the swing. I mean, this was a long time ago, so that was how things were. My grandfather's this friend, and the moment they saw each other, 13 and 14, they were in love, and they were the rest of their lives for like 100 million years they were together, and it sets this bar impossibly high for a lifelong commitment. You've cleared that bar in the present time, I'm happy to say, but
yes, it took a bloody long time.
Along the way.
I think for a while, the Sunday Times were kind enough to run an extract, or various extracts from my book, in the magazine just before publication. And when they sent through the extracts, I just thought, oh my God, I read the first sentence was, I fell in love with a man at work. I thought, what? And I thought, he never knew, and now everybody who reads the Sunday Times is going to know. It literally never occurred to me. Of all the themes in the book about religion, mental illness, resilience, cancer, how we carry out distress, it literally never occurred to me that what the Sunday Times would choose to focus on would be my disastrous love life. But it was what they focused on. So
it is very funny. I mean, you tell it it's one of the most humorous parts, because you're almost relishing the adventure as it goes through.
Well, it's funny. It's funny because I'm probably quite naive about this, in the way when I wrote it, you're sitting at your computer on your own, and you're not really imagining anybody else reading it. And there's something, and even the book, you're thinking, well, is anyone going to read the book? I don't know. So somehow that felt okay, but in the Sunday Times magazine, it sort of didn't feel okay. And then suddenly I'm, the kind of most famous, for a few days, the most famous sort of ex-spinster in the country. And the headline was like something like, how I found love at 51. And a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in the sitting room, and my iPhone pinged, and the headline was "How I Found Love at 51." I thought, oh gosh, someone else did. And then it was like, oh no, that was me on Apple News, that piece. So,
and the subtitle of the article, I read it earlier today, was "It's never too late!" exclamation mark, as if you were the living proof of this.
I know, a kind of Miss Havisham finally sort of bursts out of her cobweb-ridden, basement or whatever. And then the next day, in fact, I was in the Daily Mail for, and they got me all trussed up in a kind of very fancy red dress. And to my horror, they have you sitting there, and then somebody hands you in the studio, this kind of Valentine's shaped balloon. So you're sitting there with a Valentine's balloon thinking, this isn't really quite what I had in mind in terms of brand image. But horrifyingly, that was on the on the front page, on the masthead of the Daily Mail. And underneath it, I mean, really tragically, was 48 hours to save Europe from war, which of course hasn't happened, but it was a very, very peculiar and embarrassing juxtaposition. So yes, my love life, I think we can safely say, has been deeply unfortunate. And you're right that in terms of good people and bad people in the book, I mean, not that you can, generally speaking, divide people into those categories. However, let's just say I was not particularly attracted to the nice guys for whatever reason, and it generally didn't work out well most of the time.
Let's talk about resilience. Why don't you like the word resilience just before we do talk about it? Is it because it implies some sort of, I mean, it's like sometimes one of those things like losing a battle with cancer or winning a battle with cancer, isn't it? It sort of can imply, oh, you haven't got resilience. Oh, how weak of you somehow. Is that
I think it's partly, it's not really a word I ever used. And then it became a kind of corporate buzzword, and also not just corporate, but kind of everywhere. School children being taught about resilience, and then they had no doubt very well-paid trainers going in to teach people about resilience. And I'm just always very skeptical of these things, because unfortunately I think most things in life you have to learn by going through them, and I wish there was a shortcut, but there isn't really. So I'm also, it's a bit I don't really like polysyllabic words. It's not that polysyllabic, but it's a kind of Latin-y word. And
it is a bit. I mean, it started life 90 years ago as a concept in humanistic psychology.
Oh, did it?
Yeah, it was quite Jaap van Praag, who founded the modern humanist movement in the Netherlands. Who was a psychologist, also wrote about resilience, and he meant it originally, and it then sort of crept into Rogerian psychology and into mainstream psychology, and then like you say, suddenly this concept pop out and become very they permeate everywhere. But he used it in quite an interesting way. He was talking about the resilience that people had, not only to withstand events, but also to sort of keep their integrity. So he studied people who gave people up to the Nazis and people who didn't, and the sort of resilience of people who didn't, what it took to sort of stand up against that sort of. And that's its historical origin. So we want a word though somehow that conveys the same thing, sort of, not just surviving but thriving and getting through things and changing as a result.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you, it's interesting. I mean, I think character really, really matters. It's not the same, but I think what he was studying with character essentially, obviously pushed to its limits in that kind of situation. But funnily enough, when I was doing an interview for The Bookseller, Caroline Sanderson, who interviewed me, came up with a word I thought was great. And even though it is also polysyllabic and Latinate, I prefer it. And it's fortitude.
Well, fortitude's a good one.
Yes. I think it just sounds a bit, I don't know, maybe resilience has just been ruined for me by the corporate bollocks. But
well, no, it's interesting you should say that, because, I'm fortification of yourself is another concept that Jaap van Praag.
Oh, really? How interesting. How interesting.
Yeah, so this is all a humanist perspective on these things. Well, it would be, wouldn't it? Because it's about the human being building their own resources to deal with this. Character and fortitude. So how do you think your own fortitude was fostered and developed?
Through an awful lot of things going wrong, basically. Right. Certainly my sister's illness that was a very difficult thing for all of us, but obviously most of all for her. But she was unfortunately sort of a difficult child. She would have what my mother called scenes all the time. And then she went into a psychiatric hospital for a while. I mean, she was a very sweet, lovely person. And talk about fortitude, she had it in spades. She really, really, really had it.
That's really
in spades. And in fact, I remember when I wrote the eulogy for her funeral, I remember writing that my sister was the bravest person I knew, and suddenly realizing that that was true. She was incredibly brave. But I suppose, going through sort of dealing with her illness and also her envy of me, which unfortunately was entirely understandable, because she had this younger sister who didn't have a mental illness and who apparently sailed through her exams and was academic, and whereas Caroline was struggling to do her exams. She wasn't particularly academic. She had pockets of brilliance, but she wasn't particularly academic, but also had to do all her exams on hefty doses of antipsychotic drugs. So that was very difficult. Those were the first things. And then various things. I developed suddenly really severe acne in my early 20s. I mean, like, I had, bad spots as a teenager, as lots of people do, but suddenly it kind of exploded. And that was very upsetting. I think acne is very upsetting for anyone. And I've met people who've been deeply scarred emotionally as well as physically by their acne. But also when you're a young woman and you're just trying to kind of find your place in the world, and suddenly you look, your kind of face is kind of full of sort of, suppurating mess. It's a dreadful thing. And then I developed these mysterious pains in my ankles, which spread up to my knees, which were eventually diagnosed as lupus, autoimmune disease. So I ended up at age 26 with a diagnosis of what I was told was an incurable autoimmune disease, crippled with pain, unable to walk more than a few yards, unemployed, without a boyfriend, a virgin. It wasn't great. Hence the fuck off God, Satan, you can have me. But so by 26, I had already been through a lot, and that was, before all kinds of other things happened.
And so these, you're honed by misfortune in that respect, you think, and because it just, I mean, in what way? What does that give you? Because obviously you've survived. You're at the other end of it. The output is a you that is still, whole and has chosen to go on. But what does it? How does it change your misfortune to build character? That's what I'm trying to think.
Yes.
What changes about you as a result that allows you to cope with then, the even worse things that happened to you in the 20s?
Yeah. Well, I think one of the key things is I think it can work both ways, actually. I think people can be scarred and brutalized by suffering. Yeah. If you see, child soldiers or people who've been abused or all kinds of people, it's certainly not automatic that it makes you a nicer person. But I think the other way it can work is that it can foster profound empathy and compassion for people and arguably make you a nicer person. I think also at some level, you understand, I mean, we're all going to learn eventually that suffering is a part of life. And those of us in the Western world, generally speaking, have not suffered hugely in our societies. I mean, for example, I was very, very, very upset about Brexit. And I'm very, very, very upset about the political situation and our prime minister and the lying and corruption in government and so on. However, obviously, that's in a different league to what we're currently seeing in Europe. But so I would say that generally speaking, the circumstances of our lives are relatively comfortable compared to many people in the world. Although obviously there are many people, even in this country, living in quite severe poverty. But I think it makes you understand that the world doesn't revolve around you. You're not the center of the universe, and suffering comes to everybody. And in a sense, I mean, I'm not pleased to have had the things happen to me that have happened to me, but, they did. And I'm the person I am because of them. And thank God I'm, well and happy at this point in my life and count myself extremely lucky. But I think that we're all going to have to learn at some point how to deal with misfortune. So there are ultimately some advantages in how to learn that when you're younger.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, my own situation in terms of family is not completely dissimilar to yours, although I still have my mum. But there was a period just before our last convention, actually, when, you know, both my mum's parents, my mum's only brother, and then her other son, my only brother, all died in succession in 3 years. And you do become very aware that, and my father had died about 10 years ago when he was 53. And it's funny in your book when you say you think about getting to the age when, in your case, your brother, in my case, my father died, and you do think, well, when I've got to this age, that's, you know, I'm ahead of the game in some ways.
Absolutely. That's
counted as a blessing in that respect.
Exactly. That's exactly what I feel. But I also feel, as a result of that, and I wonder if you do, Andrew, I don't know if you've got there yet, but that feeling of, I can't be bothered with the bollocks anymore. I really can't. I just want to do what matters. And I don't want to spend.
Very much so. Yeah.
Do you?
It definitely changes. It changes your perspective on almost everything. I mean, I made some very big changes in my life. You know, I moved out of London and moved my mum in, and, you know, did loads of sort of sudden changes after my brother died, because I thought, well, you know, one of the lessons you take from that rapid loss of your entire family, apart from one, is why wait?
Exactly.
For this, that, or the other thing. Let's do it now. If we're going to do it, let's do it now. But it also changes how, you know, you don't care so much what other people think of you. You don't. A lot of things become unimportant in comparison with what you. So that does change us. It does change. It's changed you, changed me. I think that's right. So even if we're not quite sure what the process is that leads to it, it definitely has that profound effect. And I think that's what the ancient Greeks said. You learn through suffering.
Yes, but I don't think it's automatic. I think some people don't learn through suffering. I mean, well, I was going to say I don't want to be unkind, but hey, okay, so Boris Johnson had COVID. Did that affect his attitude to the pandemic? I'm not sure that had a big impact. That's a relatively trivial example. He nearly died of it, actually. But he still then, a few months later, when he was advised by SAGE to do, you know, what they advised him, actively decided to go against that advice and literally said, let the bodies pile up. So so you don't.
He might have done even worse if he hadn't had COVID, Christina.
Well,
that might have been the improvement.
That is true. Logically, I can't argue with you on that one. That's true. But I don't think learning through suffering is automatic. And I also think sometimes you can see in people's faces, some people become very bitter as they get older, and you can see that in their face, because I think we do become more ourselves, and it becomes more visible in our features and in our voice and in our behavior. So I think we can learn through suffering, but we cannot learn through suffering.
I think this is a sort of timeless question, really, isn't it? Do human beings have to suffer? You know, do you have to be unhappy to know what happiness is? Do you have to suffer to know what pleasure is? Do you know, there's no pleasure without pain, etc.
All of the above.
Exactly. And I think it's true, isn't it? I think it's true. It's part of the human condition. Here's a question from someone in the audience. Why do you think you were attracted to all the not so good guys? What's the psychology? What's the psychology behind that?
You tell me.
You didn't always know they weren't good.
No, that's exactly right. I didn't always know they weren't good. I don't know. I don't know. I mean, I would hardly be the only person in the world of either sex for whom, or however many sexes there are now, for whom that would be the case. But I do think, for example, I think charm is very interesting, because many of us, and, you know, again, Boris Johnson is a case in point. Many people claim to find him charming. I have been attracted to some charmers in my time, but the thing about charm is that it's superficial, and or often superficial. I mean, you can be a lovely person and be charming, but you can also be charming and be a complete shit. And I think probably, you know, there were rather too many of the latter.
The questioner rushes in to say, by the way, they're not being judgmental. They did exactly the same thing themselves. This might also be part of the condition, human condition. I think, tell us about the psychiatrist. You know, that's the funny one. Because I think you told that story in Leicester as well, actually.
Oh, did I? Did I really? Oh, really? God, I'm
sure
really
there
surprised.
was well, there was a similar. I won't spoil it by saying why I thought that, but I'm sure there was a similar.
How interesting.
Revelation.
Well, I was in a cafe in Sweden, in Stockholm, with a dear friend who was taking part in a poetry festival in Stockholm, and she, because I'm half Swedish, she said, "Oh, do you want to come along for the ride?" So I did, and it was all magical, beautiful. It snowed. It was like fairyland. It was wonderful, and we were at this cafe, and this a tall, handsome guy came and sat with us because there weren't any tables, and we got talking, and it turned out he was half Scottish and half Swedish. And I had never in my life met anybody else who was half Scottish and half Swedish. And he was also a psychiatrist at a central London hospital. And he was dividing his time between Stockholm and London, which seemed to me a very sophisticated thing to be doing. Anyway, he hooked me in, and it, needless to say, it didn't turn out well, but he did actually tell me that he was a psychopath. I mean, when a psychiatrist tells you they are a psychopath, you should probably listen. And by the way, psychopath doesn't mean axe murderer. It does mean someone with minimal capacity for empathy, and who doesn't care really about other people. So obviously, rather loud warning bell, but unfortunately I'd been hooked in by then. In my defense, I will say it lasted, as most of my romances did. It was very, very brief, but I do remember I was reviewing for the Observer at the time, and I had to do a monthly roundup of first novels. It was a lot of work. I think I did something like 6 books a month.
Gosh, yes.
And on top of a very, very full-time job. And I remember emailing Robert McCrum, who was then the literary editor of the Observer, and this guy, who'd better remain nameless, had invited me to, he had as well as everything else, he had a country house, and he'd invited me to his country house for a weekend. And I remember emailing Robert and saying, "I'm sorry, I'm in love. I can't do my reviews this month." I can't believe I did that, because I'm always such a goody-goody. I never ever miss a deadline. Anyway, he let me off, and I went away for this weekend, and it was obviously a complete disaster. And that was that.
Because that must say, I mean, not many people would respond to the personal ad that said, "By the way, I've got no empathy and limited capacity."
Well, it wasn't a personal ad. He said it sort of in passing. Yeah, but it was no, I agree with you, Andrew. But on the other hand, he was unfortunately, he was the archetype, very brilliant, very charming, very handsome, and very funny. So, what's not to like, apart from psychopathy, obviously.
This has now become the topic of all the questions. So here's another.
Ask me something else, somebody.
No, that's all people want to know about now. I recommend the book. For more, read the book. Is there an evolutionary point about the attraction to the bad guys, suggests one of the audience? Why are there bad guys at all? Presumably because they attract members of the opposite sex and they can reproduce. Well,
it probably is an evolutionary thing. Probably is an evolutionary thing about, scattering sperm as widely as possible, and, God knows what. So I'm no evolutionary theorist, but I imagine so.
Well, I suppose that is one of those things, isn't it? I mean, it's a bit like, because actually, like you say, when you refer to, you're referring to our current Prime Minister, but you could think of lots of politicians or successful men, especially in history, who've got to the top of hierarchies, political hierarchies, especially, with, one might argue, minimum empathy and minimum
absolutely
and maximum ambition and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. So, well, I do. Yeah, I think that's.
You're no different from Western society, Christina. I mean, your susceptibilities. That's what
exactly. And we know, don't we, that there are more. There are a disproportionate number of CEOs as psychopaths. We know that, don't we?
In the corporate sector. In the private sector.
Is it only in the corporate sector?
Not in the charity.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm just assuming, because
Andrew, I wouldn't make assumptions if I were you.
I can't empathise with that, Christina.
But also in politics, it's absolutely evident that the people who, not that people don't have, good motivation for going into politics, plenty of people, but anyone who wants to run a country has to have serious, a very, very hefty dose of self-belief, and probably a pretty substantial dose of narcissism, because any sane person would think, well, obviously I couldn't possibly do that.
It couldn't be me. Exactly. Yeah. Robin Cook's wife. Robin Cook was the foreign secretary, wasn't he?
Yes. Ethical foreign policy. He was.
Yes, and she wrote a book called something like Masters of the Universe, or something like that, about men who succeed in politics.
Oh, that's interesting.
And about her husband as well. And she said, yeah, he was just as bad. They were sort of ruthless, egotistical in the literal sense, alpha ape type men who, and so, well, she ought to have known. Although I think they get divorced, or
they did. Well, he ran off. He ran off with somebody else. So I suspect.
Oh, okay. So she.
Let's give her the benefit of the doubt and assume it wasn't all sour grapes. Although it has to be said that if Robin Cook, well, he didn't visibly have the charm and the looks, but he may well have had the ruthlessness. But I mean, I think Keir Starmer doesn't have that ruthlessness, and he's a nice guy. But unfortunately, people. The jury is currently out as to whether being very bright and a nice guy is enough, because I think people do, whether it's charm, charisma, charisma is something that is pretty necessary for politicians, and and he doesn't have it.
There are countries, of course, where their politicians aren't attractive or charismatic, and they're just sort of technocratic, almost functionaries, and often with electoral systems that are more proportionate, you get
exactly. I mean, if you look at Scandinavia, as always, but
they're much more boring, but they're quite great. Good at public administration.
Exactly.
Well, that's good. Now, we've wandered so far there from anything really, that I don't know where to go next, because the questions are still on attraction.
I can't see them, but enough of my disastrous love life.
What about, someone speculates it might have been about physical attributes.
Well, I think we can safely say that when you're, looking for a sexual relationship, it's not entirely superficial to take physical attributes into account.
Very true. Here's a good question, and it's in part it leads, as the questioner says, off to some extent what we've been discussing. How do we get more women into positions of power? This is completely not on the topic of your book, but do you know what? It's just something you're qualified to answer.
I think it's very, that's such a big question. It's a very difficult one as well, kind of see above really, in terms of what we were talking about in terms of confidence, narcissism, etc. Because, for example, if you look at the women who are powerful in this country, like Priti Patel and Liz Truss, they seem to score pretty high on narcissism, more highly than one might argue, given that Liz Truss seems to be our Instagram foreign secretary, more highly than your average woman. And traditionally, the qualities that enable leaders to succeed are about ruthlessness. They are, I've interviewed an interesting guy called Douglas Board, who wrote a book called Elites last year about sort of whether you can rise to the top and be a decent person. And he's worked as a senior headhunter for many years. And his argument actually was that it was quite difficult because elites tend to, in any sector, probably more, I think in any sector actually, because he did operate in the public sector as well as others, and with sort of public appointments and so on, sort of government board appointments. Elites hold power and foster power and pass on power, and they tend to pass them on to people they perceive to be part of that elite. So it's a self-perpetuating system, really. And traditionally, people talked about, the golf course and so on. And I'm sure there is still plenty of that. But I think it's much more about thinking what power is, and not perceiving that a competent woman fits the mold
for that power, for the power you're looking for. Yeah. And there was a difference, I think, if you think about when I sort of reflect on dealing with governments pre-2010 and then pre-2015 and then post-2015, they do value different things. And, you know, power looks different to different people depending on their political perspectives and also their generation.
Yes.
And, you know, if power to you is like someone who looks like a head boy or a prefect or whatever, you're going to replicate that, whether it's a woman or a man that you're looking for. Whereas if power looks like something that's come out of the trade union movement and it looks like being listening and open to others or whatever, not that that's everyone out of the trade union movement, but you know what I mean, 40 years ago. Then you replicate that instead, don't you? So you're saying sort of that women would be succeeding in that current system because they were evincing the attributes that were more typical of the dominant men in those.
Well, I think very often they sort of have to, not universally, but quite often. And I do think the other thing is, and everybody will have heard this, and I can't remember the exact statistic, but generally speaking, if a woman looks at a job ad and you know, it's got 25 criteria and she doesn't hit one of them, she'll say, oh, I'm not qualified to apply for that.
We have this all the time when we're choosing lecturers, you know, when we will invite people, we do have these lecture medals every year, or even convention speakers, and we'll you know, you'll email 30 women and say, could you give a talk on this sort of topic? And you know, half of them will say, I'm not sure that I'm, you know, qualified enough.
I know. And
30 men are all saying, yeah, absolutely, I can talk about that.
Talk about anything. And I think that operates absolutely everywhere. And I think that's a really significant factor. I think what baffles me is that how intelligent, I understand how stupid people have a lot of confidence because they don't understand that they're stupid, but I really don't understand how very intelligent people think, oh, I think I'll be prime minister or whatever, or I'll be home secretary, because obviously it's a nightmare job. Now I admire, you know, the job's got to be done, so obviously it's much better that it goes to somebody bright and thoughtful and competent, which by the way it generally doesn't, but it is better that, you know, intelligent people put aside their self-doubt to some extent so that they take on those roles, because all of these things have to be done. You know, things have to be led, people have to be on boards, organizations have to be run, countries have to be run, etc. But what seems so strange is that intelligent, highly intelligent men can think, oh yes, I'm really well qualified to do that. Whereas, I mean, I don't understand how an intelligent person can look at a job like Home Secretary and think, oh yes, I'll do that. I'll sort out immigration. Well, good luck to you. I mean, how apart from Brexit, which obviously, you know, A, is a nightmare and B, has not exactly sorted out. I mean, now we're having to import people in, but they'll be the wrong colour, won't they? Now we're having to bring the brown people in to fill the jobs, which obviously, if you voted on the basis of racism, is, you know, your worst nightmare. So everything is about trade-offs. Every single kind of government policy is about trade-offs, and people who understand the complexity of that and realize that you are going to have to make kind of better choices where possible, those people are going to often lack intellectual confidence, or they might have the intellectual confidence but place that in a real world context, and they will say, well, yeah, that's really difficult because X is going to suffer. I mean, it's a bit like today I was on the Jeremy Vine show talking about a sort of absolutely gut-wrenching report from Mariupol. And I was asked about the no-fly zone. I mean, you know, A, why on earth would I know whether there should be a no-fly zone? But B, all I do know is that I don't think Putin's bluffing, and he has nuclear weapons. He quite likes to play with his toys, and no-fly zone is World War III, unfortunately. So however much you don't want to see a country decimated, you also don't want World War III. And these are the kind of choices that politicians and leaders have to make. That's a very extreme one, but agonizing to make them. So it seems a real shame that it's the really cocky ones who get to make those choices rather than the thoughtful ones who think, I'm not sure I've got the ability to do this.
I think it's even worse than that. There's someone usefully in the chat suggests something which will come to in a moment. But I think that what you just said, it's even worse than that, is that there are studies in the same way that there are studies of why unintelligent people think, you know, that show that really unintelligent people think they're really, you know, they don't know how unintelligent they are because they're intelligent. But there's also an equivalent study that shows how intelligent people think that everyone's as intelligent as them. So intelligent people don't realize how, you know, so that when they're holding themselves back from going forward for certain roles or something, they're thinking, oh, well, there are other people just as good as me,
Yes.
that can do it. Everyone must sort of be, the same sort of qualifications as I have. No, not at all.
Interesting. How
Yeah.
interesting.
So it's the opposite effect.
Yeah.
They're not quite flip sides of the coin, because of course the one thing with unintelligent people, it's about making a misjudgment about yourself. With intelligent people, it's about making a misjudgment about others. So they're not quite the direct opposites, but they're similar effects. Someone in the chat suggests, or in the question suggests, that one way to do this would be to switch out the word power and instead talk about responsibility.
Yeah, that's a really
good point,
really interesting point. Yes, exactly. But yes, exactly. Very good point.
Someone asks, how do you personally react or manage your reactions to actually, I must share this other thing. Our event manager has just sent a message to me and you, Christina, but I think I can share it publicly. Not only will 30 men say yes to giving a talk, whereas 30 women, only half of them say yes, 30 men will email in unasked to suggest that they give a talk. Because they've got an interesting one to give you. So that's an interesting perspective. That's good inbox management, Ian, event manager there. So there's a question here: how do you react or manage your reactions when you have encounter religious fundamentalists? Does this come up very often in your work? In your life?
I don't. Well, my partner's eldest son is a born-again Christian, actually.
Oh, there you go. So it's going to be a theme.
Yes, so it does come up, and he knows I'm not. He's a really lovely guy, but obviously that is a belief clash. I did some years ago. I did a piece about the prevent strategy for the Sunday Times magazine, which involved interviewing masses of people, sort of essentially Muslim fundamentalists, and it was about countering radicalization. So I'm very distrustful of, as I'm sure anyone watching this is, of fundamentalism, but it is a fact of life, and it features in all kinds of contexts, and it doesn't need to be religious belief. We've seen over the past 2 years how tragically the Brexit divide then got transposed onto the pandemic, and so then we had the anti-vaxxers and the COVID deniers, and you would literally have people going into ICU saying they don't believe in COVID. And I had a cleaner she came 2 hours a fortnight, lovely Polish woman. We were kind of, I wouldn't say exactly friends, but we were close to each other. When I had cancer, she was really sweet. I really cared about her. And it turned out she wouldn't get vaccinated, and not only that, she doesn't believe in COVID. And so at that point I thought, well, very sadly, I can't actually have you in my flat if you don't believe in COVID, because I've had cancer twice and I really would rather not get it. This is free, so I think we, and I do think that the Brexit debate partly became a form of fundamentalism, actually. So when I'm on Sky or a radio show with, and obviously you're generally put on with someone who's got a different view to you, you just have to be polite and respond to the arguments. I do think, very sadly, that very few people change their mind through argument. I think most people hold their beliefs emotionally, and to go about changing people's minds, whether it be on COVID vaccination or anything else, it's a kind of slow, careful process where you have to hear things from people you trust, and it's not, I think the awful thing is you can be sort of instantly converted into absolute nonsense, but you're very rarely instantly deconverted from absolute nonsense.
Yeah, and I mean, I think even people who in principle are committed to rationality and to thinking things through and doing their mental spring cleaning every now and again, and like checking their beliefs against the evidence, even there you can easily be captured by the other part of your brain, the sort of more mythical part of your brain that's saying, no, this is a really beautiful thought, let's have this as true instead.
Exactly. Well,
Jonathan, we'd like this to be true, let's have this instead.
Exactly. Well, I think we all do that all the time in all kinds of ways. And Jonathan Haidt, in his what was it called? His book, The Righteous Mind.
That's right.
He talks about the elephant and, you know, who's driving us basically, and it's rarely the rational part of that.
Rationality. Steven Pinker's new book Rationality is really good on this too. He talks about the two parts of our mind, and he makes the really interesting point that and this comes back in a sense to these conspiracy theories and so on, is he said for most people, you know, they've got the reality mindset and they've got the mythological mindset, he calls it. And the reality mindset is, you know, things that you know about how the microwave works, how the car works, that you've got to, you know, open the book to read it or switch on the plug to make this thing, useful beliefs that are in your rational mindset. And then he says, then there's the ones that aren't that type of belief because they're about things that are very far away or long ago or things you don't know about. And then he points out that for most people that includes things about science, things about viruses, things about the corridors of power. He's talking about this completely crazy conspiracy theory in America about, you know, there being child abusers hidden under pizza restaurants or something, and
QAnon and
owns them, or that's it, that one. And he says, you know, that it doesn't take long to realize that this isn't really a reality mindset belief, because people are posting reviews of pizza restaurants saying, you know, I think this is one of the places. And he said, if they really believed it, they'd call the police, you know, they'd do something about it. So in a way, it's not quite a real belief in the same way as these other real beliefs are. And I think that's quite interesting.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But I reviewed a book about QAnon, and it's really, I mean, it's the baby boomers who are the key sort of subscribers, that ideologues. They've been sucked in via Facebook apparently. So you're perfectly sensible people who.
There is a media literacy question here, I think.
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah, and so and then the kind of Instagram yoga mums who then, you know, and you just think, goodness, there's some really surprising groups that get sucked into this nonsense.
Goodness. Well, I'm glad that instead of being out there on social media, the people who joined us this evening were with us instead, listening to your very good sense. And I hope that after this is over, they'll go straight online or to their local independent bookshop in the morning. Exactly. Yes, of course. There are websites where you can now find your local independent bookshop suppliers and buy it from there. By the way, I'm not sort of strangely twisted in my chair. It's just if I stop rubbing my dog's ear, she's going to start barking. So I've been rubbing her ear for the last 10 minutes to make sure we have a peaceful end.
Brilliant.
There's the book, Outside the Sky is Blue. Do go and buy it. Christina, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me. I've really, it's been a fascinating conversation, Andrew. I wanted to ask you lots of questions. But
no, well, next time in person. Good night.
Bye.